Carlos dragged the mop across the factory floor, invisible amidst the deafening racket of the machines. Nobody noticed his sharp eyes, his roughened hands. To them, he was just the cleaner. A faceless, voiceless man. Suddenly, a metallic crash echoed through the place. The factory's biggest machine stopped with a dry, guttural roar. Chaos followed. Engineers dashed about, bosses barked orders, and production teetered on the edge of collapse. But while everyone else was losing it, Carlos just stood there, watching. He knew what had gone wrong. He always had. But who'd dare listen to the cleaner? Time was ticking, and one truth became clear. Either Carlos spoke up now, or everything would be lost. One chance, one idea, and this time, the world would have to listen to him. The alarm rang like a relentless siren at 5 in the morning, echoing through the small flat. Carlos opened his eyes, feeling the weight of another day pressing down on him. The bed beside him was empty. His wife, Anna, had already gotten up to make coffee. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to muster the strength to get up. Each day felt the same as the last, like he was stuck in an endless cycle of exhaustion and insignificance. With a sigh, Carlos got up, pulled on his simple, worn clothes, and headed to the kitchen. The smell of coffee was comforting, but it also carried a bitter reminder of reality. He approached the table and saw his son's face in the photo they kept beside the coffee maker. The child's smile gave him strength, reminding him that everything he did was for them. But still, the emptiness lingered. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he fought each day, he remained invisible, both to the world and in a way to himself. At the factory, the routine swallowed him up. The metal gate groaned as it opened. Like even the steel was weary of the repetition. The cold floor reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, making the place feel even more oppressive. Carlos knew where he was, but it felt like his existence there didn't matter. The weight of the mop in his hands was almost comforting, too familiar, as though it had become an extension of who he had turned into. The factory workers rushed past him, talking about numbers and deadlines, closing big deals, while he was just the bloke who cleaned their path, quite literally. No eye contact, no gestures, nothing. Not even a good morning or a thanks. To them, he was just the cleaner, a faceless blur, with no story. And Carlos had learned to accept that, even though, deep down, he felt a quiet anger, a timid flame, almost extinguished, reminding him that he had more to offer. The noise of the machines dominated the space. The roar of gears mixed with the thick smell of oil and burnt metal. Carlos knew that sound better than anyone. He heard it every day, analyzing the details as he mopped around the machines. He understood the whispers of the gears, the rhythm of the chains and shafts. While everyone else focused on the big numbers and complex solutions, Carlos saw what they missed, the little details, the warning signs of bigger problems. But who would listen to a cleaner? Who'd believe that he knew anything about those machines? The truth was, Carlos had always paid attention from day one. He knew exactly how each cog worked, how the whole system fit together, where every piece slotted in. But the most frustrating part was that nobody ever asked. He wasn't seen as someone who could offer answers, just someone to keep the floors spotless. And that, to Carlos, was a daily punch in the gut. A constant reminder that, no matter how much he knew, his words held no value in that place. When the shift ended, the exhaustion dragged him back home. The route was always the same worn pavement, the same empty streets, mirroring the monotony of his life. But when he arrived at his small flat and saw Anna's smile and his son's curious eyes, something shifted. For a few moments, he allowed himself to forget the factory, the weight of invisibility. There, he was more than a cleaner. There, he was a father, a husband, and that gave him a flicker of hope that one day things might change. At night, when the factory was far behind and the darkness enveloped the flat, Carlos lay in bed with a single idea stuck in his mind. It was something so simple, so clear to him, he couldn't understand why nobody else saw it. He knew the factory was on the brink of a major problem. He knew exactly how to fix it. But every time he thought about getting up and telling someone, fear gripped him. Who would listen to his words? Who would take the cleaner seriously? This doubt followed him every day, an internal struggle that grew quietly. With each mistake he saw at the factory, with each machine failure he could predict, the flame inside him burned a little brighter. Time seemed to be running out, and Carlos knew that, sooner or later, he would have to make a choice. Stay invisible or finally stand up and be heard. In the factory, the relentless pace of production never let up. The assembly line worked like a well-oiled machine, perfectly in sync, until an odd noise broke the rhythm. A loud metallic crash echoed through the warehouse, reverberating like an emergency alarm. One of the company's largest and most expensive machines had come to a halt. The engineers exchanged looks, stunned for a few seconds. Chaos quickly set in. They rushed about, examining the machine under the tense gaze of the directors, who were pushing for answers. Production had stopped, and every minute lost was costing thousands. The silence of the machine was deafening. Carlos was there as usual, mopping the floor near the confusion. His eyes followed the engineers' frantic movements, watching as they pressed buttons and checked control panels, but failed to find the problem. He already knew what was wrong, but the weight of being invisible kept him rooted to the spot. Who would listen to the cleaner? While shouts of orders echoed down the corridors and faces grew more desperate, Carlos silently observed, his heart pounding. The engineers were speaking in complicated technical jargon, using words that would be incomprehensible to most. But Carlos understood. He had overheard these conversations thousands of times while cleaning around the machines. And in that moment, he knew what had gone wrong. A small part, an almost imperceptible fault that had escaped the trained eyes of the specialists, but not Carlos, who knew these machines almost intimately. Sweat dripped down the brow of one engineer, who in frustration kicked the side of the machine. "This could ruin us," one of the directors shouted, his face red with anger. The tension in the air was palpable, as though something was about to explode at any moment. Production was at a standstill, and every tick of the clock seemed to weigh heavily on everyone's shoulders. There was unrelenting pressure to fix the problem, yet no one seemed to be getting any closer to a solution. Carlos looked down at the hands gripping the mop. They were trembling, not from fatigue, but from a mix of nerves and certainty. He knew he had the answer, knew he could fix this, but at the same time, he felt the weight of the quick, impatient glances he received while cleaning. He knew that, to them, he was nothing more than a bit player in their game. And yet, there he was, holding the knowledge that could save the factory, if only someone would listen. A part of Carlos wanted to just walk away, to let the engineers flounder in their failed attempts. After all, he had nothing to lose. But at the same time, something inside him was growing with each passing minute. A voice, once a whisper, was now shouting, "Speak up! Do something!" The doubt gnawed at him. What if they ignored him? What if they mocked him? He was all too familiar with that feeling. Years of being dismissed and overlooked had fueled his insecurity. As the shouting grew louder and the pressure more unbearable, Carlos couldn't take his eyes off the machine. He knew the answer was right there, as clear as the floor he just cleaned. He could sense the nervousness in the engineers and directors, and it only made the flame inside him burn brighter. But to speak? To risk his dignity? To risk being seen as the fool who dared to interrupt those who supposedly knew better? And then, as if time had frozen, Carlos took a step forward. It wasn't a big or dramatic move, just a small step, almost imperceptible to anyone watching. But for Carlos, that step meant the world. It was a step against the fear, against the invisibility that suffocated him day after day. And in that moment, he knew. Either he spoke now, or he'd let the opportunity slip away forever. The engineers were still debating, passing blame and offering empty suggestions. The directors pressed for a solution, but nothing was changing. And there, in the middle of all the chaos, Carlos knew he had the answer. The decision to speak or remain silent was like a noose tightening around his throat, growing tighter with each second. He was standing on the edge of something big, but the fear still held his words back. The floor beneath his feet seemed to tremble, as if the very factory was waiting for his next move. The silence in his mind stood in stark contrast to the chaos around him. And the question that pounded inside him was simple but powerful. Will anyone listen? The night settled heavily over the small flat. Carlos sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee cooling in his hands. The soft sound of the TV came from the living room, where his son was watching a cartoon, laughing every now and then. But Carlos wasn't listening. His mind was stuck in the factory, on the sound of that failing machine, on the chaos, the desperate faces. And the idea he had kept locked inside himself. He knew what he should have done. He should have spoken up, raised his voice, and said what was so obvious to him. But the fear of being ignored, of being ridiculed, still paralyzed him. Years of being treated as invisible had built barriers that were hard to break. Why would anyone listen to the cleaner? That thought echoed in his mind like a curse. Anna, his wife, noticed the deeper silence than usual. She sat down in front of him, her face lit by the dim kitchen light. The usual smile she always brought to him was absent. She recognized that look on Carlos. He was wrestling with something. "What happened today?" she asked, her voice calm and gentle. Carlos hesitated for a moment, holding his breath. He never liked bringing the weight of work home, but tonight was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd let something slip. So finally, he began to speak. He told her about the problem at the factory, the engineer's desperation, the machine that stopped, and how he knew what was wrong, but didn't have the courage to say anything. Anna listened in silence, her eyes fixed on his, absorbing every word. She knew Carlos better than anyone. She knew how much he observed, how much he understood about those machines, even though he had never been trained to. And she knew how much he struggled with his own insecurity. When he finished, she leaned slightly forward, gripping his hand firmly. "You have to speak up, Carlos," she said without hesitation. "You know what's wrong. You've got what they need. If you don't speak, you'll never know what could have been. Don't let them keep underestimating you." Anna's words hit Carlos like a blow. She had always been his safe harbor, the one person who saw beyond his insecurities, beyond the role he played at the factory. But there was something more in her voice that night. There was urgency, a confidence that he still couldn't feel in himself. Anna believed in him, and that on its own began to break the invisible chains that held him back. He lowered his head for a moment, feeling the weight of his emotions pressing down. "But who's gonna listen to me, Anna? I'm just the cleaner," he murmured, his voice thick with deep frustration. He wasn't sure if it was a question or a resigned statement. Anna didn't waver. "They'll listen, not because you're the cleaner, but because you have the solution. It doesn't matter who you are, Carlos. What matters is what you have to say. And if you don't speak, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have made a difference." Her words pierced through Carlos's doubts, but at the same time ignited a flame. She was right, and he knew it. The weight of being invisible, of being underestimated, couldn't keep suffocating him. He had spent years in that factory, watching, learning in silence while others spoke. But now, the moment had come. Either he would speak, or he'd remain a shadow. That inner conflict, which had always been with him, seemed to reach its peak. Anna's words still echoed in his mind as they went to bed that night. "If you don't speak, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering." The thought pulsed, reverberating in the darkness of the room. And Carlos knew, deep down, that the time to speak up was closer than he was ready to admit. The next day, the journey to the factory felt heavier. The bus he took every morning was packed with weary workers, lost in their routines. But this time, Carlos wasn't just physically tired. His mind was in turmoil. The idea he had kept inside that had burned within him was ready to be put to the test. But at the same time, the fear was there, an invisible yet solid barrier. As he arrived at the factory, the sound of the machines enveloped him once again. The same scene as always, the same hurried faces. But for Carlos, something was different that day. He could feel the tension in the air, the nervous glances from the engineers still on edge from yesterday's failure. And once again, he knew he could fix everything. He knew that, at that very moment, the decision was in his hands, to stay invisible or to be heard. The factory was the same as always, massive machines roaring, workers rushing about. But for Carlos, that day felt different. The sound of the gears seemed louder, the fluorescent light above him brighter, and the weight of responsibility on his shoulders heavier than ever. He gripped the mop in his hands, but this time they trembled, not from exhaustion, but from a mixture of fear and determination. His eyes shifted towards the main machine, the one that had stopped the day before. It was still malfunctioning. The engineers were still scrambling to save it, fiddling with its panels, consulting manuals, but nothing seemed to work. The tension in the air was palpable, like everyone was on the verge of a collective breakdown. Carlos knew deep down that this was his moment. Carlos watched in silence, his thoughts in turmoil. Today might be the day. The phrase echoed in his mind. Since his conversation with Anna the night before, that idea hadn't left his head. He knew he had to speak up, knew the solution was within his reach. But at the same time, doubt still consumed him. His eyes fixed on the machine. He knew every movement it made, every sound. The fault was there, so obvious to him. How could no one else see it? How was it possible that the engineers, with all their expertise, couldn't spot what was right in front of them? And more importantly, who was he to correct these specialists? Carlos's breathing grew heavy. The noise around him seemed to grow louder, like a rising roar pressing in on him from all sides. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to calm his thoughts, but the image of the factory grinding to a halt, production teetering on the edge of collapse, wouldn't leave him. He knew that if he didn't do something, the problem would only get worse. The factory was losing thousands every minute that machines stayed down. Then, he heard it. Anna's voice echoed in his mind, clear and firm. If you don't speak up, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been. Carlos's heart pounded harder. He knew she was right. He knew that if he let this chance slip away, he'd never forgive himself. But the fear was still there. The fear of being ignored, of being ridiculed, the fear that his voice wouldn't be enough. He looked around, his eyes landing on the engineers, their tense faces, the bosses standing with their arms crossed, their expressions grim. Everyone was so wrapped up in their own frustrations that no one even noticed his presence. And that invisibility, which had suffocated him for so long, suddenly felt like armor. Maybe that was it. Maybe this was the right moment to use silence to his advantage. With one final breath, Carlos let go of the mop. The sound of the wooden handle hitting the floor echoed in his ears, like a warning that something inside him was changing. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the stopped machine. The world around him seemed distant now. The pressure, the tension, all of it felt far away. His mind was focused on one thing, the solution. As he approached the engineers, his presence went unnoticed. They were still deep in debate, eyes fixed on the screens and charts, oblivious to Carlos standing beside them. He felt his insecurity stir, the fear trying to claw its way back, but he stood firm. Not now. Today he would speak. Today his voice would be heard. He cleared his throat, a barely noticeable gesture, but it made two of the engineers glance at him. Their looks were indifferent, as if they were seeing nothing more than the cleaner asking to pass. Carlos felt the heat rise to his face, the weight of embarrassment tightening in his chest. What if they don't listen? The doubt rose like a wave, but this time, Carlos crushed it before it could hit. He stepped closer, now standing right in front of the engineers. "I know what's wrong with the machine." This time his voice was louder, more assertive. One of the engineers stopped and stared at him. The look on his face was skeptical, almost irritated. "What?" Carlos took a deep breath. His moment had come. "The coupling gear in section 2. It's misaligned because of wear on the part that connects to the main motor. I saw it yesterday when I was cleaning the area. If you adjust the part and replace it with a spare, the machine will start working again." The silence that followed his words seemed to freeze the air. The engineers stared at him, the skepticism still plain on their faces. But one of them, after a long pause, turned towards the machine, as if what Carlos had said had planted a seed of doubt. He began checking the area Carlos had mentioned. The chief engineer, who had been observing the chaos from a distance, stepped closer. "Browning, what's he doing?" he asked, his voice laced with incredulity. Carlos stood still, his heart pounding wildly, but he knew he had said what needed to be said. Minutes passed as the engineers checked the points he had highlighted, and then suddenly one of them looked up, surprise written across his face. He's right." The tension still hung in the air as the engineers worked on the machine, adjusting the part Carlos had mentioned. The atmosphere was thick with expectation. The silence was broken only by the sound of metal tools and the whispered instructions being exchanged between the technicians. Everyone was waiting for the result. Every second felt like it stretched into hours. Carlos stood off to the side, his heart still racing, but now there was a flicker of something else inside him. Hope. He had spoken up. Whether they believed him or not, he had taken his chance. And now they were actually following his lead. The sound of the final adjustments echoed through the factory, and the chief engineer gave the signal to start the machine. Carlos watched, holding his breath. The whir of the engine slowly filled the room as the machine sputtered to life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the gears began turning, slowly at first, then faster, until the machine was back in full motion. A collective sigh of relief washed over the room. The tension broke as the engineers exchanged glances, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. The chief engineer looked at Carlos, still with a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Good call," he said, nodding slightly before turning back to his team. Carlos felt his legs go weak, but not from fear this time. It was the overwhelming rush of relief, of knowing that for once he had been heard. He had made a difference. As the factory noise returned to its usual rhythm, Carlos picked up the mop again. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just the cleaner anymore. He had a voice, and today it had been heard. Carlos stood a few steps away, feeling his heart pounding in his temples. It was as if time had slowed down. He had spoken, finally, and now his idea was being tested. Was I right? He wondered, though deep down he knew he was. Still, the fear of failure lingered, a shadow whispering in his mind, trying to drag him back into the insecurity he had fought so hard to overcome. The minutes dragged on, but suddenly the sound of one of the gears turning filled the warehouse. The engineers stepped back, surprised. The machine roared back to life, with a sound that shattered the tension in the air. What had once been a symbol of chaos was now the sound of victory. It was running again, perfectly, steadily. Carlos felt his chest expand with relief, as if he could finally breathe after holding his breath for hours. He remained still, his hands still trembling, watching as the engineers exchanged looks of astonishment. There was no room for doubt now. He had been right. The chief engineer, who had previously ignored his presence, walked over to Carlos. There was a mixture of disbelief and respect in his eyes. He stopped in front of the cleaner, a brief silence forming between them before he spoke. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Carlos looked at him for a moment, still processing everything. He opened his mouth to reply, but the weight of all he had carried for those years hit him at once. He wanted to say that he had spent years watching, that he knew every machine as well as he knew his own hands, but the words got stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply answered, "I always pay attention." The response was short but loaded with meaning. The chief engineer nodded slowly, as if beginning to understand that Carlos was far more than anyone had imagined. And for the first time since stepping foot in that factory, Carlos felt truly seen. Not as the cleaner, not as a nameless face, but as someone of value. The engineers, now curious, started asking for more details. They wanted to know how he had noticed the fault, how no one else had seen it. Carlos explained, slowly, still surprised to find himself at the center of attention in a positive way. The feeling of being heard, of being respected, was new, and he was still getting used to it. Meanwhile, the factory director, who had been watching from a distance, approached the group. He, who had barely known Carlos's name before, now looked at him with sharp attention. "Carlos, is it?" he asked, as if only now realizing who he was. Carlos nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. "What you did here today? You saved the factory from a massive loss. We can't thank you enough." Carlos listened to those words with a mix of relief and disbelief. For so many years he had grown accustomed to being ignored, treated like part of the scenery. Now he was hearing words he had never imagined. Recognition. The weight of it all was so immense that he had to hold his breath for a moment to keep from becoming emotional. I just did what I thought needed to be done," Carlos replied, his voice calm but filled with restrained emotion. The director looked at him more closely, assessing the man who, until that moment, had seemed invisible. "I think we need more people like you, Carlos," he said, extending his hand. "From today, you're part of the factory's technical team. We can't afford to lose someone with your insight and ability." The words echoed in Carlos's mind like silent thunder. The technical team. He, who had spent years cleaning the floors, was now being invited to join the group he had always watched from afar. It was a moment he had never anticipated, and the weight of it nearly overwhelmed him. He shook the director's hand firmly, feeling the symbolic strength of that gesture. As the day ended, and Carlos left the factory, something inside him had changed forever. It wasn't just the recognition, it wasn't the new role, it was something deeper. He had spoken, he had been heard. When he got home, the first thing he did was embrace his wife. Anna looked him in the eyes, knowing that something had happened. "So, how did it go?" she asked, with a soft smile on her face. Carlos looked back at her, still processing everything. "You were right," he said, his voice low but full of gratitude. "I spoke, and they listened." Anna smiled, her eyes filling with pride. "I knew you could do it." In that moment, everything seemed to make sense. The journey of invisibility, the doubt, the fear, all of it had led to this point. Carlos now knew that, no matter how simple it seemed, he had a place in this world. And more importantly, he had proven to himself that a person's worth isn't in the title they hold, but in the courage to make themselves heard. Carlos returned to the factory the next day, but something felt different. It wasn't just the uniform. He now wore the blue overalls of the technical team, instead of the cleaner's apron. It wasn't the badge that bore his name alongside the title maintenance technician. The real change was in the way people looked at him. The same colleagues who once ignored him, who passed by without noticing, now greeted him with nods and respectful smiles. Carlos walked through the factory halls with a new sensation, the feeling of being seen, of being respected. He knew it wasn't just about the new role or the words of recognition he had received. What filled him was something much greater, the certainty that he had finally found his place. He passed the large machines that had been his silent companions for so long. He looked at each one, remembering the nights when he had dreamed of being more, of being part of something bigger. And now, here he was. Not as a silent observer, but as someone with a voice, someone who was part of the factory's workings. As he adjusted a gear alongside the engineers, men who just days ago barely knew his name, Carlos realized that the transformation wasn't just around him. It was within him. The courage he had found, the step he had taken to be heard, had changed who he was. He had broken the invisible chains that had kept him trapped in insecurity, and in doing so, he had not only changed his destiny, but also that of his family. When he returned home that night, the smile on Carlos's face was broader, more genuine. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the laughter of his son running around the living room, and Anna waited with the same look of belief she had always had in him. He told her about the day, about how everything had changed, and she listened with the same pride she had felt all along. But now, the pride wasn't just hers. It was his too. Carlos sat down at the dinner table, with Anna and their son by his side, and for a moment he let his eyes wander around their small home. Nothing had changed in that modest space. The same walls, the same wooden table. But to him, everything felt different. Because now he knew he was capable of much more. He knew that, with perseverance and courage, he had overcome the barriers life had put in front of him. Carlos's story wasn't just about a broken machine or about getting a new job. It was about the silent struggle he had faced every day, and the moment he decided that he wouldn't be defined by what others saw in him. He had shown everyone and himself that a person's value lies in their determination and in their courage to stand up, even when the world insists on not hearing them. Now, looking at his family and the future ahead, Carlos knew this was just the first of many achievements. He had won the hardest battle, the battle against his own doubt. Sometimes the greatest challenge is believing that your voice deserves to be heard. Today, we saw how Carlos, a man invisible to many, found the courage to show his true worth. He faced his doubts, overcame his fears, and transformed his life with a simple yet powerful idea. An idea that changed everything. If you enjoyed this story of overcoming and transformation, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who could use a bit of inspiration. Stories like Carlos's are a reminder that a person's true value lies in what they're capable of doing, not in the title they hold. Thanks for watching. Check out more inspiring stories in the video cards above. Keep following our stories. The greatest ideas often come from the most unexpected places.